the morning Voss Tower nearly killed, everyone began like every other morning on the site. Steel singing in the wind, concrete mixers grinding their slow rhythm, and the distant percussion of rivet guns echoing off glass that had not yet learned what it was about to witness. Diana Voss arrived at 7 sharp heels, striking the temporary walkway boards with the authority of someone who had inherited an empire and spent 3 years proving to every skeptic that the inheritance had been deserved. She moved through the site the way she moved through board meetings, too fast for anyone to catch their breath, too confident for anyone to raise an inconvenient question. Behind her, her project director Marcus Sloan carried a tablet and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. At the far end of the Isterden trench, a man in a faded hard hat and a vest worn smooth at the elbows was crouched over a clipboard, tracing load calculations with the unhurried focus of someone who had stopped caring what he looked like to people who had already decided what he was. Edmund Hale, 61, site supervisor, took the man they kept on after the restructuring because it was simpler than the paperwork of letting him go. Marcus introduced him with the particular carelessness of someone gesturing at furniture. Diana glanced up from her phone, just long enough to take in the worn vest, the pencil tucked behind his ear, the clipboard covered in hand-drawn diagrams rather than the digital readouts her engineering team produced. She laughed, a short, genuine, entirely dismissive sound, and told him that a man who still drew blueprints by hand had no business questioning systems designed by engineers with credentials that filled 3 pages. Edmund stood slowly, joints protesting the crouch he had held for the better part of an hour. He looked up at 72 floors of glass and steel catching the early light above them. Then he looked back at Diana, his voice low and entirely without theater. Then your tower won't stand, he told her, and returned his eyes to the clipboard. Nobody laughed. Marcus stepped in quickly to move the group forward. But the words followed every person who heard them for the 11 days that came after. Edmund lived in the kind of apartment that makes no attempt to impress anyone. 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, and a drafting table that occupied more floor space than the dining table it had quietly replaced years ago. The walls held no certificates, no framed degrees, no photographs of ribbon cuttings. There was one picture, a bridge shot from river level, its span carrying morning light the way certain structures do when they have been designed with enough honesty to last. Edmund had designed that bridge in his 40s. It still carried traffic. He never mentioned it. For 25 years he had been among the most respected structural engineers in the country, the kind of professional that other engineers called when a calculation needed to be trusted rather than simply verified. He had spent those years in the particular silence of people who do consequential work without needing an audience for it. Then Diana's father retired, and Marcus Sloan arrived with a restructuring plan that was clean on paper and surgical in practice. Edmund's design authority was quietly reassigned. His access to the core structural database was reclassified. His title became site supervisor, which sounded like a lateral move to anyone who did not understand that it was the equivalent of asking a surgeon to manage the supply closet. He had taken it without a public fight, because the people worth fighting for were the ones still on the site every morning, the junior engineers, the ground crew, the technicians who had not yet learned to be cynical about the gap between what the documentation said and what the structure actually needed. Edmund had noticed something wrong in the foundation stress readings three weeks into the project. The eastern load-bearing columns were showing numbers that did not match the design specifications filed with the city, the kind of discrepancy that looks like rounding error until you understand what it actually means at altitude. He had filed a report through the proper channel. Marcus had buried it without forwarding it upward, and Edmund had said nothing further, choosing instead to watch, to document quietly in his own notebook, and to wait for a moment when speaking the truth might actually be heard rather than managed into silence. The morning Diana Voss laughed at his clipboard, he had already been waiting for 3 weeks. He was very nearly out of time. 9 days before the inauguration, the first hairline fracture appeared on the 14th floor load transfer plate, a thin diagonal line that a junior engineer named Priya Desai photographed, flagged, and submitted to Marcus before the end of her shift. Marcus reviewed it in under 2 minutes and sent back a 3-word response. Standard settlement, continue. Priya filed the dismissal without comment, the way junior engineers on Marcus's team had quietly learned to file everything that came back from above. Accepted on paper, held privately in the part of the mind that keeps its own record. 2 days later, the Eastern Foundation vibration sensor recorded an anomalous pressure reading during a routine load test. The report was revised before it reached Diana's desk. The anomalous figure replaced by the projected figure, the difference small enough to be invisible to anyone who had not been watching the raw data. Edmund noticed the revision because he had been watching the raw data. He documented it in the same worn notebook he carried everywhere, added it to the pattern he had been building since the 3rd week of the project, and said nothing to anyone on Marcus's team. A delivery of reinforcement steel arrived for the upper floors, and Edmund checked the grade, marking against the specification sheet as a matter of habit. The numbers did not match. The steel that had been ordered and the steel that had been delivered were 2 classification grades apart. A difference invisible to the eye and devastating to the calculation. He photographed the marking. He noted it. He said nothing yet, because he had learned the hard way in a career spanning 3 decades that raising an alarm without complete evidence only gives the people managing the silence more time to clean it up before it can breathe. That night, at the drafting table, Edmund spread the original Foundation blueprints, photographs he had taken on his phone during the first week before his access was reclassified, and ran the full load calculation by hand. The kind of calculation his team now did in software. The kind of calculation he had been running by hand since before most of the site's engineers had started secondary school. He finished past midnight, set his pencil down, and stared at the wall for a long time. The numbers he had arrived at described a building that could not safely carry the load scheduled for Inauguration Day. Not even close. Edmund requested a private meeting with Diana and was given 15 minutes the following morning, which he understood meant 10. He arrived with his notebook and his photographs and the calm, methodical manner of someone who has delivered difficult news, often enough to know that the delivery itself is never the hard part. He laid it out without drama. The eastern load-bearing columns had been constructed with reinforcement steel 2 grades below specification. The stress distribution across 4 key structural points was operating outside safe tolerance by a margin that the design software had been not have flagged because did not reflect the materials actually used that did not report the materials actually used. The accelerated completion schedule Marcus was driving would place full operational load on a system that could not safely carry it, on a timeline that left no room for the discovery of that fact before the wrong people were inside the building. Diana listened with her arms crossed and the careful expression of someone deciding whether to be concerned or offended. When Edmund finished, she told him gently, and with a finality that left no room for revision, that the validated modeling data produced by her engineering team, whose combined credentials she named with visible pride, could not be overridden by hand calculations on a worn clipboard prepared by a site supervisor whose last design credit predated the software they were using. Marcus added, smoothly and without hesitation, that Edmund's original report from 3 weeks earlier had already been reviewed by the senior technical team and found to contain fundamental methodology errors that disqualified its conclusions. Edmund asked to see that review. Marcus told him it was internal documentation, not accessible to site supervisors. Edmund stood, tucked his notebook under his arm, and walked out without raising his voice, without giving either of them the satisfaction of watching him rattled. Outside, he stopped at the edge of the foundation trench and looked up at 72 floors of glass and steel with the particular clarity of someone who has been right about something dangerous before, that the building itself would have to prove what he could not. He went home that night and quietly contacted the Regional Structural Safety Authority, flagging the procurement records he had photographed before his access was removed. A precaution. The kind that experience teaches without needing a lesson. 6 days before inauguration, the eastern facade of Voss Tower developed a visible stress fracture. It ran diagonally across 3 floors. Floors 19 through 21 wide enough to be photographed from the street by a construction worker on a neighboring fat site before Marcus's team had finished arguing about what to call it. Internally. Before, the fracture appeared on the outside of the building only because the damage inside had progressed far enough to run out of places to hide. Marcus ordered it assessed, classified as cosmetic finishing variation, and addressed with remedial sealant before the end of the day. The word cosmetic moved through the site in the particular tone that words acquire when everyone using them knows they are not accurate. 2 days later, a second fracture appeared. Lower, wider, running in the opposite direction across floors 11 through 14. The two fractures together formed the diagonal cross pattern that structural engineers recognize as a column under compression stress beyond design tolerance. The kind of pattern that, once seen, cannot be unseen by anyone who knows what it means. A senior engineer on Marcus's own team, a man named David Ossie, who had been with Voss Construction for 11 years, and who had never once filed a complaint, pulled Marcus aside and told him, in the careful language of someone choosing their words with precision, that the fracture pattern was consistent with load transfer failure in the eastern column cluster, and that the failure was progressive. Marcus thanked him, told him the remedial team was already on it, and suggested David focus on the upper floor completion schedule rather than foundation concerns that were outside his current project scope. David went back to his workstation and sat for a long time without opening his laptop. Deanna, meanwhile, had begun receiving calls from investors. Not the warm, anticipatory calls of the preceding weeks, but the cooler, more carefully worded calls of people who had seen the photographs circulating online and wanted to understand what a cosmetic finishing variation looked like from the inside of a building they were about to have their names attached to. She pulled up Edmund's original report for the first time. The one Marcus had told her had been reviewed and classified. She searched for the attached review. There was no attached review. There was only Edmund's submission, unread, time-stamped 23 days earlier. She held that timestamp in her mind for a long time before she picked up her phone. She found him on the site, not at home, not at a coffee shop, not anywhere that required a search. Edmund Hale was exactly where anyone who actually knew him might have expected. Standing in the Eastern Foundation trench at 6 in the morning, running informal stress measurements along the column bases with the equipment he had brought from his own apartment, because the site's monitoring instruments had shown him numbers he no longer trusted. He did not look surprised when Diana climbed down into the trench wearing site boots that had clearly never been worn before. He waited while she found her footing on the uneven ground, the same patience he brought to everything. She asked him directly what he had actually found in those calculations, not a command this time, not a dismissal framed as a question, but the first real question she had asked him since he set foot on her project. Time. The kind of question that arrives too late in most situations and exactly on time in the ones that still have a chance. Edmund told her plainly. Column. The reinforcement steel used in the 4 eastern columns was 2 classification grades below the specification filed with the city. The difference in procurement cost, multiplied across the tonnage, required for a 72-floor structure represented a sum large enough to explain why someone with budget authority and procurement access would find the substitution worth the risk. The falsified delivery records he had photographed were consistent with a pattern of substitution that had been operating across at least 3 previous Voss projects, based on the procurement trail the safety authority contact had begun pulling before dawn that morning. Deanna said nothing for a moment. Then she asked him what it would take to fix it. Edmund gave her a number and a timeline. Neither of them comfortable, both of them honest. He would need unrestricted access to the full structural database, every technician on the Eastern Column team, and no interference from anyone above him in the chain of command. He stated the conditions without apology, and Diana agreed to them without negotiation. Understanding that she was not in a position to negotiate with the truth, back on the site, Marcus grew visibly uneasy the moment Edmund arrived with that level of authority. His practiced ease, the confident, slightly theatrical competence he deployed in every meeting, developed small cracks that the people who worked under him had never seen before and recognized immediately as the expression of a man running out of room. Work. He offered to assist Edmund in settling back into the project. Edmund accepted politely, giving no indication that he had already sent the safety authority contact the photographs of the procurement records 3 days earlier. The repair effort that followed tested every reserve of skill Edmund had built across 30 years of structural work. He divided the Eastern Column team into shifts, prioritizing the 2 columns, showing the most advanced stress indicators, directing work from inside structural cavities that the younger engineers physically could not navigate with the same efficiency. Decades of hands-on site experience suddenly, the most valuable thing on a project that had spent months treating it as a liability. Priya Desai, the junior engineer whose fracture report Marcus had dismissed in 3 words, worked beside Edmund through the first night, without being asked. So did David Osei, who had returned to the site after his conversation with Marcus, and quietly told 3 colleagues what he had seen. The junior engineers who had been pressured into revised reports worked with an attentiveness that authority alone had never produced from them, because they were no longer working for approval. They were working for the structure. Past midnight, Marcus attempted to access the procurement database and delete the records tying his authorization signature to the substandard steel orders. He reached the server room door and found it locked, reclassified as restricted access 6 hours earlier by a quiet administrative instruction Edmund had arranged before leaving his apartment that morning. When the security team found Marcus at the door, the procurement trail the safety authority had been building since dawn was already complete enough to be irreversible. The board was assembled the following morning. Edmund presented his findings methodically, without theater, each piece of evidence building on the last until the conclusion required no interpretation. The falsified delivery records, the revised engineering reports, the procurement trail running back through 3 projects, the authorization signatures on the substandard steel orders. Marcus, sitting across the table, watched the presentation with the expression of a man who had spent his career managing perception and had finally run into something perception could not manage. Deanna stood before her own board and acknowledged, without deflection, that she had received a correct and timely warning, dismissed it, and nearly presided over a structural failure that would have placed lives at risk. She said it plainly, in front of every person in the room, the way people speak, when they have stopped trying to manage how they are perceived and started trying to be honest about what actually happened. It was, by any measure, Spelslick, the most significant thing she had done since taking over the company. Voss Tower's inauguration happened, delayed by 3 weeks, restructured, quieter than the original plan, and attended by fewer cameras than Diana had once imagined. The building that rose behind the ribbon was the same 72 floors of glass and steel, but something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the structure and the people responsible for it. Edmund stood on the ground level as the ribbon was cut, wearing the same faded vest, watching the top floors catch the morning light the way a bridge he had designed 20 years earlier still caught the river light below it. Diana addressed the assembled press and investors and did something that surprised every person present, including herself. She named Edmund Hale. She explained what he had found, explained that she had dismissed him, and stated plainly, and without qualification, that the building behind her existed because one man had refused to stop being right about the truth, even after every person with authority had told him his truth was not welcome. The offer she made him afterward, Chief Structural Advisor, Independent Authority, direct line to the board, came with genuine structural weight rather than the ceremonial title it might once have been. Edmund heard it, sat with it, and then told her he would accept it under 2 conditions. The junior engineers who had been pressured into revising their reports were to be reinstated and formally protected, and an anonymous safety reporting system was to be built into every future Voss project, one that could not be reclassified or access restricted by anyone below board level. Deanna agreed to both without asking for time to consider them. That night, Edmund sat at his drafting table with a new set of blueprints spread in front of him. The first project Diana had asked him to review for the company's next development. He picked up his pencil and began to trace the load lines by hand, not because he lacked access to the software, but because he had always believed that the truest way to understand a structure was to draw it yourself, line by line, and feel where the weight wanted to fall. The people who build things meant to last are rarely the ones standing in front of cameras at the ribbon cutting. They are the ones who were there before the cameras arrived, and who will be there long after everyone else has gone home. Edmund Hale had always known that. Now, finally, so did everyone else.